For our main program today, I'd like to share that as a former VP of programs, I prefer short, efficient introductions that keep the focus on the speaker and allow Rotarians time to ask questions. However, Hilary does need an introduction. So she will be interviewed by past President Mark Wright. I have no idea about you, but I had no idea how many acres of lands are protected and managed by the Commissioner of Public Lands for the state of Washington. Commissioner Franz is responsible for nearly 6 million acres, from coastal waters and aquatic reserves to working forests and farms to commercial developments and recreation areas. For example, she is leading the push to make Washington lands resilient in the face of climate change. We can imagine that Hilary's experience as a third-generation farmer and small forest landowner helped prepare her for this role. Hilary, we look forward to hearing how you balance resources for the varying landscapes in our state. Please welcome Hilary Franz.
Thank you, President Kim. Hilary, welcome to the Rotary Club of Seattle.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kim, and also Mark. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming out today. Looking for the conversation.
So we had a chance last week to chat for about an hour, and if you go to the website, the state website, and start looking up the scope of this job, I mean, I'm just trying to find a clean shirt in the morning, and this woman runs an agency that I don't think there's another state agency that has a more broad scope of responsibility than your agency. So the conversation that we're going to have for about the next 20 minutes will give us pull the curtain back on what Hilary Franz does and how it relates to our everyday lives. You are a lawyer by training.
That's right.
You manage the Department of Natural Resources with almost 1,600 employees. You were elected in 2016. Former Bainbridge Island City Council, correct? I want to go back to your childhood, though. Talk a little bit about your childhood and how it relates to the way that you view public lands today.
Yeah, so I had the great fortune of being raised by a single father and my grandparents. I actually got to grow up in Portland, Oregon, all the way to Pierce County. My grandparents came to Washington State in 1938 in the midst of the Great Depression. My grandfather's farm that had been the family of 12 was going under. Obviously, the black blizzards of South Dakota left much of the Midwest in complete poverty and destitution, and they were blessed to come west, not knowing where they would land, but they landed in Pierce County. I always say to people, just imagine Pierce County in 1938. I mean, and you're coming from the Midwest and the black blizzards. But I was raised by my grandparents on a farm in Pierce County. At the same time, I was also raised by a single father who's a Portland employee. So I spent after school in City Hall watching Portlandia from 1970 to 1980 in real life.
Were there hippies in Portland at that point, or was that later?
I think there were hippies probably way before I
grew up as a hippie, so I can make that joke.
I missed it, thank you.
Yeah. Let's talk about the scope of the job. When people ask you in an elevator, oh, what do you do for a living? What's the 30-second speech of what the job entails?
30 seconds, I'm going to try. So I actually oversee 6 agencies total in Washington State under my purview. First is I oversee Washington State's wildfire fighting team. In addition to that, I oversee the largest amount of recreation area, only second to the federal government. I oversee Washington Geology Survey. So think about Washington State. We have 5 live volcanoes. We have the threat of the big earthquake, tsunamis, landslides. So everything under the earth, we're grabbing that data and information and doing our best to educate and inform public and communities. In addition, I oversee 2.6 million acres of aquatic land. So think the entire Pacific coast, the Puget Sound, your rivers, lakes, and streams, including South Lake Union. Manage all those leases from ports to marinas to shellfish and aquaculture. I then oversee 3 million acres of uplands, everything that is not underwater, and I don't mean financially. So about 2 million acres of timberland, 1 million acres of agricultural land. We're the largest wheat grower in Washington State. My goal is to make us the largest vineyard grower in Washington State, and we're rapidly getting there. Yes. In addition to that, oversee also some of the high yield crops to low yield crops like grazing and dry, and then also oversee a pretty significant growing energy portfolio from 21 wind leases, and we're process right now of trying to lock down 35 solar leases of the largest solar farms in Washington State over the next 2 years. And then I oversee a commercial, residential, industrial portfolio. So how many people know the Edgewater? That's the People's House. I hire a hotel management company to run that on your behalf. Good martinis. In addition to that, I also oversee Costco, Safeways, Fred Meyer's, Swedish Hospital's a tenant. I've got business parks, and just yesterday I signed a deal on a new Bartels.
So now you get an idea of why my head was spinning last week when we were talking. So I'm going to break down each of these. And one thing that I didn't know until we had our conversation last week is that your agency helps counties manage a large amount of public land. You told me in King County it's somewhat less than 1% of the operating budget that comes through the land that you manage for the county. But you told me in some counties, the land that you manage, that's public lands, you lease and you have other ways of making money. And in some counties, that's up to 40% of their operating budget.
That's right. So the way in our uplands, we manage those 3 million acres in uplands largely on behalf of schools and counties. So we generate about $325 million a year. About $125 million funds the construction of schools that our kids are taught in, and K through 12 university community colleges. The other $200 million funds our counties. We have land in all 39 counties of the state. As you were pointing out, our portfolio in King County, because of the diversity of King County's economic base, we represent about 0.08% of their operating budget. But in many counties, especially our more rural counties, we represent about 40% of their entire operating budget. And if you actually roll back, go 3 generations back into the context actually of the period of, for example, spotted owl, many of our rural counties who are in those timber towns on the coast and the southwest, we used to represent 80% of their entire operating budget. So our agency truly feels not only the environmental responsibility of managing these lands in stewardship intergenerationally for the future, also the economic responsibility we have because we're a huge generator for those local and our state economy, but also we are truly funding basic human services, health, housing, police, fire, education, and for many of those communities, we are such a significant part of the revenue they depend on to keep that community alive.
So it really is a balance, and what you told me last week that struck me was that you are hoping to change social and environmental outcomes through public land management. So it's a real balance, right? You can't just go clear-cut everything and then cash the check. It has to be sustainable and it has to be good. Let's talk about the initiative that you have, the Rural Community Partnership, because part of your larger strategy, you told me, was to use this money to actually help communities grow. And we have a lot of rural communities that are really struggling right now in the state of Washington. Give us an example of what that partnership looks like and how it's helping to support these communities.
So part of the reason for this initiative is if you go back just generations, multi-generations, we've seen generational poverty in many of our rural communities, east and west, north and south, where generation after generation, people have not been able to look to their kids, their grandkids, and say, I promise you it will get better. And it is my true belief that we have a responsibility in this state, no matter where we live, to making sure we're providing a greater future for everyone. And I believe our agency has an ability to do that if we're more intentional about the economic opportunity we're creating. So let me talk about what that means. Intention means we generate right now $325 million on average from our lands and the management of those lands. But we have lands that actually have no leases on them whatsoever. We're generating $0 on them. That's a loss for that community, not only for the money that it would generate for their county or their schools, it's also a loss for the economy, not only that local community, but the state. So one of the things we said is if we're more intentional and we lean in and we go into these communities and say, you know best your greatest challenges and your greatest opportunities. Oftentimes you don't have access. You may not have access to land. You may not have access to financing or to state and federal programs or to economists that our agency has. So we began partnering, and in 6 months, we had 88 projects from every corner of the state. We have over 150 now. Here's an example of how a project can actually turn and change the outcome environmentally, socially, and economically for the state and that community. How many people know Red Mountain and Benton County? Okay. 2 years ago, actually in 2016, we had none of our land there being leased for vineyards. We were generating $0 for years on that land. Because a great processing facility was built right on the outside of town, right outside West Richland, which is the poorest of the Tri-Cities. Their economic development is subdivisions and development. Because of that great processing facility being built right outside the edge of town, we now have thousands of acres of land all the way to the top of Red Mountain, and now we're going up to Candy Mountain, now being planted and growing Mark Ryan, Fidelitas, Quintessence, some of the finest wines in Washington State, generating $1,100 an acre for your schools, where we were generating zero. Those are 50-year leases. In addition to that, now the community there sees that their new economic opportunity to diversify, not only their local government, but their regional government, is now the new Napa Valley of Washington State, which is closer to Seattle, and now they're seeing this as an opportunity. Instead of converting prime agricultural land, where we are jackhammering grapevines into the top of that mountain, producing some of the most beautiful wines, instead of it turning into subdivisions, will now be their new economic opportunity that diversifies. I could go on.
Yeah, so
that's just one.
So you're leasing to people who make wine. You have wind leases. You have solar leases. You have grazing leases. You have timber leases. $325 million is coming in. Tell us briefly where that money goes.
Right, so $125 million goes to schools, and $200 million is then distributed out to the counties based on their amount of land that their land in their county that it generates, and then it goes down to junior taxing districts, and it'll just go line by line. But can I do one more? Because this is where I get excited. Okay, so everybody experienced the wildfires of last year, right? I may be jumping. Uh-oh, I'm taking over. I'm sorry. Everybody experienced the wildfires last year. We had 1,850 wildfires in Washington State, the most this state has ever experienced. 40% west of the Cascades, which is a brand new phenomenon we had never seen before. And we were fighting those fires with the same resources that we've had for, frankly, 10 years. I have 7 helicopters. I now am getting 8 that all fought in the Vietnam War who help protect your state when it's on fire, okay? The reality is part of why we're seeing these more catastrophic fires is we have a forest health crisis in Washington State with 2.7 million acres of forest that are already dead or in the path of drying. Literally, if you look into the forests of the Cascades around the state, you will see the evergreen state turning brown before your eyes. The reality is we have not been treating the underlying symptom. We've been just fighting the fires, and we're spending $153 million a year on the react and in flames, smoke, and threat to our communities and our firefighters. So developed in 2017 a forest health plan, our agency, that will have us treating 1.25 million acres of forest over the next 20 years. It's about 70,000 acres a year, removing the dead, dying, diseased trees. Now you can build buildings now based on cross-laminate timber, mass timber, a new product. You can build an 18-story building out of dead and diseased trees. Canada's already done it. We will be doing it. We're building some schools here on this. When we developed that 20-year forest health plan, we sent a message to the marketplace. We said, we are going to guarantee you supply for the next 20 years at the rate of 70,000 acres a year. So you should invest in cross-laminate timber facilities in this state. And now just this month, literally within a year of that plan being adopted and developed and rolled out, we have a new cross-laminate timber manufacturing facility opening up in Colville, Washington, one of the poorest of our rural communities, creating 100+ jobs, and another one will open up in Vancouver. And not only will that keep jobs and help our rural communities and reduce our catastrophic wildfires and prevent our forests going up in smoke and flames, but it will also help us create more affordable, sustainable building product for places right here like Seattle, where we're dealing with one of the most significant homeless affordable housing crises in the nation.
Okay. So I heard you tell the story about what fire does in a managed forest and what fire does in an unmanaged forest. So what you're targeting is this forest land that hasn't been maintained. Back in the old days, fires would burn through everything, and it would pretty much wipe out the underbrush and wipe out the weak and diseased trees, and the healthy, strong trees would remain. So you were up in Tenasket area, central Washington, north central Washington, and you saw a fire that had burned through unmanaged forest, and it basically stopped where the forest was being managed. So with that 20-year plan, what does that mean in terms of what crews are going to do? And you're not getting, what I found really, you know, I don't want to make this political, but what I find interesting, we don't do a very good job of preventing things. If you heard her say the numbers, Hilary said she's bringing in $325 million in revenue a year. They're spending $150+ million fighting fires. So the math...
That doesn't come out of that budget, fortunately.
Oh, it doesn't come out of that
yeah.
budget. I'm just saying...
Don't tell the schools and
as a society,
that you can't touch that funding.
As a society, we're spending $150 million.
So this is I mean, so one of the things I found, I'm new to state government, right? But one of the things I see, and you all see it, right? We spend an enormous amount of time and money investing to react, right? Versus getting up front and investing proactively in what the actual problem is. So yes, our state is spending $153 million that comes out of the emergency fund. So it comes out of the general fund. But if we weren't spending $153 million, that could go to schools, that could go to infrastructure, that could address our transportation crisis and many other things, and it's annual. We have proven that if we have the resource and capacity to get on those fires quickly and put them out and contain them, we will reduce the amount of damage. But now that we're fighting fires in every corner of the state with hate helicopters from the Vietnam War, you can imagine how challenging that is. And the fires are going to get out of hand because we haven't invested up front. The same is true on the forest health issue. And I point that out because we're actually taking a crisis and turning it into an economic and environmental opportunity. When we go, the way we do the forest health is we're specifically going in there and removing dead, dying, diseased trees, smaller diameter. Historically, fire is not unnatural in our forests. The problem is that we've allowed so much fuel load on that forest where historically fire would come in, remove the smaller, weaker trees, allow the larger trees to get larger and healthier and more resilient that they could withstand fire. But because there's so much fuel, because we've stopped fires 50+ years ago, the fuel load has gotten so significant and the disease and insect has come in and weakened all the trees. So it literally becomes kindling on the ground. So the volatility and the intensity of that fire is so great, not even strong trees can withstand it. That's why if you go to the eastern Washington, parts of central Washington, you look at something that looks like Armageddon with just spokes of trees throughout forests that used to be, those who've been here longer than me even know how precious and gorgeous those were. Our goal is to get in, return those forests to the most resilient state that we can have it. We will reduce the fires. We will hopefully, and the goal is turn your summers back to normal so you can breathe again. And in addition to that, our goal is that we'll stimulate the local rural economy and start to address some of our stronger issues here.
And it's getting worse. I heard you say that we had 54 fires in the second week of March this year. All but one were here in western Washington. This week on King 5, we have a week-long series on wildfires in western Washington and what we're doing to prepare for them. Talk about climate change, and I feel like some of the states have done more to do things to fix climate change. When you look at the coalition of California, Oregon, Washington, BC, our federal government doesn't seem to be doing anything on climate change. What are we doing in the state of Washington? What is your agency doing, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, so we truly feel like we're on the front lines of climate change. Obviously, wildfires, our forests are dying. We're now responding to floods, which is not our responsibility, but because of rapid snow melt from Canada, Okanagan River flooded every town along that way, and they didn't have resources to respond, so I sent 300 firefighters to help fill sandbags. So we truly feel this context of being on the front line, especially since we manage 1 million acres of agriculture that needs water that we depend on. Our belief is that we've got to be focusing on two areas. One, we obviously need to be reducing our carbon emissions. Forest is one of the best carbon sinks we have, agricultural too. So we are doing a carbon inventory of the entire state's forest so we can actually start to monetize that and possibly even get more revenue and opportunity for these rural communities that have set a lot of their land aside for environmental benefit, right? And keep those forests as really valuable carbon sink. In addition to it, we are also doing a climate resiliency plan. So this state is not prepared. We have not built a climate adaptation plan for this state, and we are already experiencing the impacts of climate. We have completed the assessment of looking at all 6 million acres of land from sea level rise and ocean acidification. We generate 30 million from our geoduck shellfish industry for the state of Washington, and ocean acidification is already starting to impact that industry. In addition to that, we've assessed the other 3 million of our uplands and identified truly what do we need to do to help these lands be more resilient, because that's our responsibility as fiduciaries to the counties and schools trust. But my belief that it's not enough just to say we've taken care of these 6 million acres of land, because the 6 million acres are representative of the land throughout the entire 39 counties, the entire state. So we are developing this year a climate adaptation plan for Washington State. Our goal will be then to take that information and go work into communities who are on the front lines trying to respond, so we can get to proactive versus reactive investments. And we've already started some of those conversations. We went into Chelan and Wenatchee, who's experienced some of the worst wildfires, some of the most significant forest health crisis, as well as smoke that's impacting their economy, as well as agriculture, because orchards and vineyards are a big part of their community. And we began having a conversation with them, and we're now working side by side to help them identify how do we start with some first top items that we need to do to help that community become more resilient, from forest health and wildfire to agricultural and water resources.
Okay. As our mic handlers, I'd like you guys to get in place. I want to leave some time for you in the audience to ask some questions. And as our mic handlers get set, you know, it's always interesting to Google somebody's name, because Google will show you what other people have been looking. And so when I Googled Hilary Franz, guess what came up right after her name? Hilary Franz governor. And so I have to ask you briefly.
I'm glad it wasn't my kids.
Well, there was like net worth and husband and is she married and all that stuff. But can you address that? Would you like to be governor someday?
So thank you. That's a interesting. So I'll be honest, I've been really focused on doing this job. And as you can imagine, between ledge session and then wildfire fighting and landslides and floods, there isn't a slow day in the office. And then you take in the fact that we have enormous amount of work to do to really help grow our rural communities and our local economies that continue to struggle, even as we see Seattle in a pretty significant boom opportunity. A lot of people have been asking me to consider running for governor, which I'll say is a very big honor. A lot of people who've asked me is a very diverse crowd. I have people who are conservative Republicans in Northeast Washington, to moderate Republicans, to progressive liberals, maybe even hippies, saying, you know, Hilary, you actually take time to get out in the communities and understand what our struggles are. You don't come with sort of this belief that you know what the answer is. You actually come to say, I want to help, because I do believe I can bring resources to help in a partnership with you. I also believe that one of the most significant things right now of where we're failing, not only nationally but the state, is we spend an enormous amount of time in division and name calling and barbs and headlines. And honestly, we need to spend more time actually saying, we've got great issues, great crises that we're facing at the state and national level, where much of those crises, whether it's the fact that we believe every kid should have an opportunity, no matter where they live, to go to great schools, or every single person should have a roof over their head, no matter where they live or how they vote, and everybody should have a job that they feel is meaningful and will make a difference not only in their own family's life, but in lives of others. And if we focus on that, we will find so much that we have in common. And at the same time, we will actually get those things accomplished. We don't have that much that divides us. We truly don't. But we spend too much time trying to focus on what divides us, and as a result, we are failing ourselves, we are failing the state, and we are failing our children, and we are failing the next generation, given everything that's in front of us.
All right, thank you.
Hilary, we've got our first question here from Pete Delaney, who was introduced into this club 11 years ago by George Twiss.
It was actually 15. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. My question really has to do with what's under the public land, and that is water. Now, I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago, the Supreme Court pretty much said that old water rights and so forth were kind of thrown out. Now it's been thrown back to the counties. What's your opinion relative to agriculture, use of water, vis-a-vis fish habitat? How do we strike that balance?
Yeah, water's a great issue. It's honestly one of the same issues that why we still focus on a reaction. Unfortunately, too, we also operate in a place of being afraid to take on the water issue because we immediately know it's going to be fraught with division and war, right? And I mean war, right? If we came from it from a common place of understanding that we all know we need to depend on it, and that we all depend on the farmers who need it to grow our food, we all depend on it to actually be able to provide drinking water for our tap, and we came at it like, how do we get to a place where everybody can agree in the state of Washington of how we're going to manage our water for the future? If we started there, we'd probably be able to come up with a solution versus starting from a place of fighting, right? And I say this because managing 1 million acres of land, I was just actually in Tri-Cities just a month ago, actually on a tour of our amazing vineyards and orchards and our dry land. And I watched as somebody was, again, we've been in a drought. Part of why we were going to have a very significant wildfire crisis, and thank you, that's my knock on wood. I think there's some under there. We thought we were going to have we had the worst in the nation for wildfire, but fortunately, thank you for the sort of the fog and the gray overcast skies and the rain in July, we are back to normal. But it's because so much of part of our state was in a drought. And I watched as somebody was watering a piece of dirt, probably about 10, 25 acres, right on the side of a highway. Nothing was growing in there. He was just watering hour after hour after hour. And I asked my colleague, I was like, well, why is he doing that? Well, they're putting a shopping store in there. I go, okay, well, why is he doing that? He's perfecting his water right. So we are watering dirt, not with the intent to grow sometimes, to be able to perfect that water right, because if you don't use it, you lose it. At our agency, one of the things we're going to need to tune in is we actually watch our lessees, and they have to use the amount of water they're expected to. And if they drop below it, even if they got the same yield, we tell them, nope, back up, back up. We are asking them to use water that they don't even need to, okay? None of us, if that was our home, if that was our business, that doesn't make sense. We need to call out what's not making sense first and find agreement and alignment there. And through that small success, then move to the next one, to the next one. Because if we continue to just push it under the rug, this issue of water, we will fail. We will fail. But we've got to find the place where we can start to agree on and build that to get to a place where everybody wins and succeeds.
Please, thank you. Carl Egge has a question.
Thank you. I have a place in the Methow Valley in Mazama, so I know well fires. We've had mandatory evacuations 3 times in the last 5 years. And I'm delighted that the state is finally beginning to address the forest problem with the standing dead. But we also have national forests, national parks, Passaic Wilderness, and everything else where the fires. What's being done to coordinate with the federal government that has responsibility for the rest of the forest land in this state?
Great question. So obviously, the 2.7 million acres of forest that we have in central and eastern Washington alone that are unhealthy, and don't think that we don't have unhealthy forests in the West, we do. Half of that is federal land. And as we know, fire, disease, doesn't follow any jurisdictional boundaries. So we knew that if we did a forest health plan and we just took care of our state, we would not succeed. And so I signed an agreement with the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Agriculture in March of 2017, 3 months into office, that said, look, we already have boots on the ground. We already bring the scientists to the project. We already bring the foresters. We know how to set up a timber sale. We know how to set up a forest health treatment. We know how to get it to the mills and the markets. Let us do it for you. We can do it at greater economies of scale, greater efficiencies, and we can make sure it gets done so your forest doesn't burn. We've already completed 5 projects in all 5 national forests through that deal in just over a year. And we have ramped up that work going forward. So we are working to break down that barrier so it doesn't exist. And we said it's not enough just to take care of forest health, so we're actually doing salmon habitat restoration, and we're doing recreation trails, as well as a number of road improvement. All the things that where the federal government has underinvested, they pay us to do that work, we get it done. We created a revolving loan fund from the revenue we generate from that forest health treatment, so it will become sustaining over time, so we can continue to do that work, and so we can get our 20-year plan done.
Hilary, I want to make sure you get a good cross-representation of our club. So Jesse, who was introduced a year and a half ago, has a question for you.
Thank you, John. On the topic of forest health and climate change, there was a Swiss study that just came out that got some press about planting of 1 trillion trees could effectively eliminate climate change. So just kind of curious as to opportunities and efforts on the planting front, particularly to forest health here in Washington State.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, this is one of the challenges. When those forests burn down, here's the sad fact, federal, state, there's no fund to actually fund replanting it, right? So it's like, it's just a whammy that just keeps happening, right? So part of what the revolving loan fund, we created one on the state side and one on the federal side. So as we do a forest health treatment, for example, we did 800-acre forest health treatment. It wasn't a logging, it was a forest health, sold for $1.5 million to Vaughan Timbers up in the Northeast. That goes into a revolving loan fund. As that work happens, then it will start to fund the reforestation of those trees. Obviously, I think I'm just going to put your private sector and nonprofits here. I'm a big believer in partnerships. We all get a win when we do partnerships. Here's a huge opportunity of business. If you're trying to find a landowner, right, who's got the capacity to plant those trees, but may need additional funding since we've underfunded it, and you want to be doing something in that way, like a carbon offset fund, we stand ready for you. You know, and so I think there's opportunities for expand it and grow it, and not just based on a revolving loan fund that we've just started and created. Right now, those funds don't exist at the level we need them to. We did get $17.5 million from the legislature to do more forest health work because some forest projects pay for themselves, some do not. It depends on the distance to mill and infrastructure and the transportation costs, as you can imagine. But yeah, more to come.
So we're just about out of time. What excites you most about what you do at work every day today? Like right now, what's the topic that makes you most excited?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard one. Okay, I'm going to do 2 though. So I'm going to tell you I'll actually tell you one of the things that's most.
And briefly.
I know, that's hard. All right. I would say, okay, so first, really quick, what excites me most is, you know, and I come from a background of family who owned land, whether it was farmland, small businesses, affordable housing. And I'm a big believer that land actually creates opportunity. You are indebted with the responsibility of managing it, not just for today, but for the future in that. But it also creates opportunity. And we are now looking at our urban, commercial, residential portfolio. We have about 40,000 acres of land, only 9,000 acres in true production of revenue. And if you look at, we are the fastest growing state, the I-5 corridor. We got land in King County, Snohomish, Pierce, Kitsap, you name it, that has not been leveraged and actualized to generate money for our schools and our counties. It's also prime land for commercial residential in communities right now that are struggling just to provide housing and to grow that local economy in a way. That sits there, and I'm excited about that, as well as the clean energy portfolio. We're getting $1,100 to $1,400 an acre now in wind and solar versus $1.43 an acre. And then lastly, I will tell you in this job, the thing that most surprised me is how really every day during fire season, and last year was very, very tough, where you woke up and you just said, please God, do not take one of our own. These men and women, some of them the same age as my oldest son, put their lives on the line every single day, never asking how you vote, never asking where you come from, never asking who you are, to take care of your communities and this state. And we've had last year a number of opportunities where we sadly could have lost one of our own because we have truly underinvested in the resources they need to keep themselves alive, for me to help keep them alive. And this year, for the first time, we got $32 million from the legislature to finally get us one more helicopter from the Vietnam War era, one more plane, and 30 new full-time firefighters so we can double the capacity because they're exhausted after working such hard shifts. These guys and gals are the ones that we should all be commending as heroes. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today.
All right, thank you.